Tonight, we explore the extraordinary journey of Helen Keller, a woman who defied unimaginable odds to become a symbol of resilience, intellect, and advocacy. From her early years living in silence and darkness, to her remarkable breakthroughs with the help of her teacher Anne Sullivan, Keller's story is one of determination, transformation, and global impact. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. We hope this story brings peace and inspiration to everyone looking for the perfect video to drift off to. Now, let's turn down the lights, settle in under something warm, and begin the incredible life of Helen Keller. Helen Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in the small town of Tuscumbia, Alabama. Her father, Arthur H. Keller, was a former Confederate Army officer and editor of a local newspaper, the North Alabamian. Her mother, Kate Adams Keller, came from a distinguished background, young, well-read, and strong-willed. Helen was their first child together, and her arrival was met with joy and great hope. The Keller household sat on a modest estate known as Ivy Green, surrounded by fruit trees and wildflowers. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms in the spring, and the warm Alabama sun soaked into the wooden porch, where Helen often played as a baby. Her family lived a quiet, respectable life, rooted in Southern tradition, but with aspirations for more. Helen was a healthy, spirited infant, curious and quick to mimic sounds, gestures, and expressions. Her first 19 months were typical of a developing child. She began to utter simple words like mama and water, and her blue eyes sparkled with mischief as she followed her mother around the garden or tugged on her father's suspenders at the breakfast table. But everything changed in the winter of 1882. A sudden illness, what doctors at the time called acute congestion of the stomach and brain, struck the young child with terrifying speed. For days, she burned with fever, drifting in and out of consciousness. Her parents were frantic, fearing the worst. And just as suddenly as it had arrived, the fever passed. At first, the family was relieved. Helen had survived. She was alive, breathing, and able to sit upright. But something was different, something chillingly wrong. Helen no longer responded to her mother's voice. She did not startle at the clanging of pots or the slam of a door. Her eyes no longer followed movement, nor did they reflect the same awareness they once had. The illness had stolen her sight and her hearing. The world Helen had known was gone. In its place was a dark, soundless void. At such a young age, Helen had no memory of speech or vision. The world became a place of isolated sensations. The vibration of footsteps on the floorboards, the warmth of the sun on her face, and the feel of her mother's arms wrapped tightly around her. She was cast into a life without language, unable to name the world she lived in or understand the people around her. Her parents struggled to adapt. At first they hoped she might recover, then they hoped she might adapt. But the years that followed were filled with confusion, frustration, and chaos. Without the ability to communicate, Helen grew wild and uncontrollable. She was intelligent, there was no doubt about that, but trapped in a mind that couldn't express itself. She developed her own crude system of signs, pulling, pushing, or gesturing to get what she wanted. She would mimic the movements of others, but with no understanding of their meaning. If she was misunderstood, she would fly into fits of rage, flailing, kicking, or throwing objects. Her parents, especially her mother, refused to give up on her, but they were at a loss. By the age of 6, Helen was deeply frustrated and nearly impossible to manage. Her family's love had not wavered, but it was clear they needed help. Kate Keller began searching for answers, writing letters to experts, reading what little she could find about education for the blind and deaf. Eventually, she came across the name of Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, the famous inventor who also had a deep interest in education for the deaf. Desperate and hopeful, the Kellers traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1886 to meet with Bell. The encounter would mark a quiet turning point. Bell listened patiently to the Kellers' story. He didn't offer a cure or false hope, but he suggested a path forward. They should contact the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston. There, Bell believed, they might find someone who could help unlock Helen's potential. The letter that Kate Keller wrote to Perkins would change her daughter's life forever. And when the response came, it carried with it the name of a young teacher, Anne Mansfield Sullivan. At the time, Anne Sullivan was only 20 years old, having just recently graduated from Perkins herself. She had endured her own share of hardship. Born to impoverished Irish immigrants, she had lost much of her vision to trachoma and spent part of her childhood in almshouses and institutions. But she had a fierce intellect, a strong will, and a deep empathy born from struggle. She was exactly what Helen needed. Anne Sullivan arrived at Ivy Green in March of 1887, stepping off the train with a small suitcase and a large sense of purpose. She had no illusions that her work would be easy, but she believed in Helen's potential. What she found was a little girl filled with rage and confusion, lashing out at the world she couldn't hear or see. Anne's first priority was to establish discipline, not out of cruelty, but to build trust and structure. Within days, she convinced the Kellers to let her and Helen live in a small cottage on the property, away from indulgences and interference. It was here that the real work began. Anne started teaching Helen fingerspelling, tracing letters into the child's palm to represent objects or ideas. At first, it was meaningless to Helen. She mimicked the motions, but they carried no significance. She could not yet grasp that each sequence of motions stood for something in the world around her. Days turned into weeks, and Anne spelled words into Helen's hand over and over. Doll, cake, water, relentlessly patient, even as Helen resisted. And then came the day that would define Helen Keller's life, a spring day, warm and fragrant. Anne led Helen to the water pump, placed her hand under the spout, and began to pump the handle. As the cold stream rushed over Helen's hand, Anne spelled water into the other. Suddenly, something clicked. Helen froze. She tilted her head, then pulled away and touched the ground. Anne spelled ground. She touched the pump. Anne spelled pump. For the first time, Helen realized that everything had a name. The connection between word and object exploded into her awareness like a sunrise after the longest night. Her world was no longer silent. It was alive with meaning. Helen would go on to learn hundreds of words in the weeks that followed. She devoured language with a hunger that astonished everyone around her. But this was only the beginning of her journey. The turning point in Helen Keller's life came on March 3rd, 1887. It was a day that would mark the beginning of a transformation so profound that it would later be described as a miracle. That morning, at the Keller household in Tuscumbia, Alabama, a young teacher named Anne Mansfield Sullivan arrived. She was just 20 years old, barely out of the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, and though her own life had been shaped by hardship and poor eyesight, she brought with her a fierce determination and a belief in the power of education. Anne Sullivan had grown up in poverty, orphaned at a young age, and had endured the harshness of almshouses and institutions. Her own experiences with visual impairment and suffering had shaped her into someone both empathetic and unyielding. She had graduated as valedictorian of her class at Perkins, and it was through that school's recommendation that she had come to be Helen's teacher. When Anne first met Helen, she immediately understood the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Helen was nearly 7 years old, wild and ungoverned. Years of being trapped in silence and darkness had left her undisciplined, frustrated, and prone to fits of anger and defiance. She had no concept of language, only a few crude gestures to communicate basic desires. But Anne saw something else: intelligence, curiosity, and a spark waiting to be ignited. From the very beginning, Anne insisted on consistency and structure. Her methods were firm, but always rooted in compassion. Rather than letting Helen have her way, as her parents often did out of pity, Anne began to establish boundaries. She made it clear that in order for Helen to learn, there had to be discipline and trust. One of Anne's first major decisions was to separate Helen from the constant attention of her family. She requested that Helen live with her in a small cottage on the Keller property. This allowed Anne to work with Helen without interference, to create an environment where Helen's world could be reshaped with purpose and patience. Anne immediately began spelling words into Helen's hand using the manual alphabet, a method of finger spelling used by the deaf. At first, Helen did not understand that the symbols being traced on her palm had meaning. It was simply a game to her, a strange mimicry that didn't connect to the objects around her. Anne would press Helen's hand to a doll and spell D-O-L-L, or give her a cup and spell C-U-P over and over again. Helen imitated but did not comprehend. There were moments of progress and many setbacks. Helen would throw tantrums, break things, and resist Anne's lessons. But Anne was relentless. She continued spelling, continued associating objects with their names, even when it seemed hopeless. Her perseverance was as vital as her methods. Then, in early April 1887, came the moment that would change everything. One afternoon, Anne led Helen to the water pump outside the cottage. She placed one of Helen's hands under the spout and began to pump water over it. With the other hand, she spelled W-A-T-E-R into Helen's palm. Something about the sensation of the water, the feel of it rushing over her skin, the rhythm of Anne's spelling, caused a breakthrough. Suddenly, Helen's entire world shifted. The understanding that the motions being spelled into her hand corresponded to the cool liquid washing over her skin clicked in her mind. In that instant, Helen grasped the concept of language. It was not just about objects. It was about ideas, about naming, describing, and understanding. She later wrote of that moment saying, "That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, and set it free." Once Helen understood that words represented the world around her, she was unstoppable. That very day, she demanded to know the names of everything. She touched the earth and asked what it was called. She touched the pump, her teacher, the trees, and the sky. Anne spelled each word into her hand as quickly as Helen could touch. Within hours, Helen had learned 30 new words. Within weeks, her vocabulary had exploded into the hundreds. For the first time in her life, she was able to express herself with clarity and receive information from others in return. Her thirst for knowledge became insatiable. She wanted to learn not only what things were, but also how they worked, why they existed, and how they fit into the world. Anne was more than a teacher. She was a guide, opening every door of thought and reason for Helen to walk through. Anne also began to teach Helen how to read, using raised letters and later Braille. Helen would run her fingers over embossed words and quickly began recognizing letters and patterns. Books became her new world. Although her experience of them was tactile rather than visual, the words lifted off the page and built cities, stars, and emotions in her mind. The pace of Helen's learning stunned those around her. Her parents, once resigned to a silent future for their daughter, now watched as she learned to write with a special slate and stylus. Her first sentence, written awkwardly but proudly, was, "It is warm." Even the town of Tuscumbia began to take notice of Helen's progress. Newspapers picked up the story of the blind and deaf girl who had learned to communicate. Her fame began to grow, albeit modestly at first. People marveled not only at Helen's intelligence, but also at Anne Sullivan's extraordinary teaching methods and dedication. Their bond grew deeper with each passing day. Helen depended on Anne not just for education, but for connection, for emotional stability, and eventually for friendship. Anne, too, came to see Helen as more than a student. She became a part of her life, inseparable from the girl's future and success. By 1888, just a year after Anne arrived, Helen was already reading and writing, spelling out long passages, composing simple essays, and beginning to grasp abstract concepts. She even visited the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston that year, where she met other children with disabilities and found a larger world waiting for her. At Perkins, Helen encountered innovations and educators that further stimulated her mind. She experienced the ocean for the first time, feeling the waves crash against her body and spelling the experience into words as Anne guided her through the sensory world. Helen also met Laura Bridgman, the first deaf-blind person to be successfully educated in the United States. Though their meeting was brief, it left a deep impression on Helen. She saw a reflection of herself, and also a glimpse into what might be possible. But this was only the beginning. Helen was not content to simply learn basic skills. She wanted to master language and to explore the depths of philosophy, literature, and science. Her ambition, now freed by communication, knew no limits. And Anne, ever devoted, was right by her side, ready to guide her through the next chapters of a life that was just beginning to unfold. By 1889, just 2 years after the breakthrough at the water pump, Helen Keller's life had taken on a remarkable transformation. At not even 10 years old, she had achieved what many thought impossible: communicating, reading, writing, and exploring abstract ideas. But Helen's ambitions were not limited to catching up with other children. She wanted to surpass expectations, to truly understand the world in its vast complexity. Helen's days were filled with rigorous learning. Anne Sullivan, her companion and translator, introduced her to history, mathematics, geography, poetry, and classical literature. The two would sit together for hours, Anne spelling into Helen's hand as they worked through pages of Homer and Shakespeare, volumes of Dickens, and texts on natural science. Helen not only absorbed information, she wrestled with it. She asked questions. She wanted to know why things happened, not just how. Anne's teaching method had matured into a deeply intuitive process. She tailored each lesson to Helen's unique learning style, combining touch, movement, and emotion. When teaching geography, she used clay to model mountains and rivers. For science, they conducted simple experiments with water, plants, and heat. Helen explored each concept not with her eyes or ears, but with her hands and her mind, making every discovery tactile and deeply personal. Her progress continued to attract attention. Articles about her extraordinary learning journey began appearing in national publications. By 1890, Helen was already making waves far beyond her hometown. But while the public was awestruck by her accomplishments, Helen herself was unsatisfied. She didn't just want to be able to read and write. She wanted to speak. That summer, Helen began taking speech lessons at the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston. She studied under Sarah Fuller, who specialized in helping deaf children develop vocal speech. Through intense sessions involving lip reading by touch and vocal mimicry, Helen began the painstaking process of learning how to speak aloud. It was difficult. Her first spoken word was, "It is warm," the same phrase she had written years earlier. Her voice was breathy and strained, and though she would never speak fluently or be easily understood by strangers, the fact that she could produce intelligible words at all was a triumph of will. But Helen's true fluency was always in her writing. Her connection to language, formed in the palm of her hand, gave her a distinctive voice that resonated in every word she penned. At just 11 years old, she published a short story titled The Frost King. It was meant as a heartfelt tribute to her favorite teacher at Perkins and a demonstration of her literary skills. But the joy of its release quickly turned to controversy. Staff at Perkins discovered that the story bore a strong resemblance to an earlier tale by Margaret Canby, a children's author. Accusations of plagiarism swirled. Helen, devastated and confused, insisted she had no memory of ever reading Canby's story. She couldn't understand how her mind had seemingly reproduced it unconsciously. A formal inquiry was launched at the school. For Helen, the ordeal was crushing. The very foundations of her developing identity as a writer, a thinker, and a person of integrity were shaken. Anne Sullivan, fiercely protective, stood by her. So did others who believed that the similarities had been a result of cryptomnesia, an unconscious recollection from years earlier, buried in Helen's memory. Ultimately, no formal punishment was given, but the incident left a scar. Helen withdrew emotionally and began to doubt herself. She would later refer to the Frost King as a sorrowful experience that taught her the dangers of imitation and the complexity of memory. Still, the episode didn't stop her. In fact, it became a pivotal moment, one that strengthened her resolve. She wanted to prove that her ideas, her thoughts, and her voice were truly her own. She began to write more seriously, journaling daily, composing poems, and writing essays about her experiences, her views, and her dreams. By 1894, Helen was a teenager and already considering the next great leap in her education, preparing for college. Few girls at the time aspired to higher education. For a deaf-blind girl, it was almost unthinkable. But Helen believed nothing was impossible. With Anne Sullivan still serving as her interpreter and constant support, Helen enrolled in the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, a preparatory academy designed to ready girls for entrance into Radcliffe College, the women's coordinate of Harvard University. It was at Cambridge that Helen faced perhaps her greatest intellectual challenge. The curriculum was intense, filled with Greek, Latin, German, French, algebra, geometry, and literature. Every textbook had to be spelled out letter by letter into her hand. Anne read aloud every word, every sentence, every problem, and every paragraph, tracing each concept with her fingers, while Helen absorbed it with razor-sharp focus. The strain was immense. Anne's health began to suffer under the weight of such constant interpreting. Helen, too, grew physically and mentally exhausted, sometimes studying late into the night and rising again before dawn. But despite the overwhelming demands, Helen pressed on. She later described her years at Cambridge as among the most difficult of her life, but also the most rewarding. Her ambition was not only personal. Helen knew that every step she took forward opened doors for others like her. She was aware that her life had become a symbol of potential, of education, of what could be achieved with the right support and relentless determination. And in the background, more figures were beginning to shape Helen's journey. One of them was John Albert Macy, a Harvard instructor who would become her literary mentor and eventually Anne Sullivan's husband. Macy played a crucial role in helping Helen revise her early writings and navigate the world of publishing. His presence marked the beginning of Helen's emergence, not just as a student, but as a public figure. By the end of the 1890s, Helen Keller was on the brink of achieving what no person with her disabilities had ever accomplished before. Her mind, which had once known only silence and darkness, was now preparing to enter the halls of higher education. But even as she studied, wrote, and prepared, she remained curious, deeply interested in politics, religion, and the deeper moral questions of society. It was clear that Helen's story was no longer just about education. It was becoming something far bigger, a mission to understand the world and ultimately to change it. By the dawn of the 20th century, Helen Keller was preparing to do something unprecedented, become the first deaf-blind person in history to attend college. In the fall of 1900, she entered Radcliffe College, the women's counterpart to Harvard University, located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. At just 20 years old, she stepped into a world that had never before accommodated someone like her. Radcliffe was intellectually rigorous, and for Helen, the challenges were immense. Every lecture had to be interpreted into her palm by Anne Sullivan, who sat beside her in class, spelling rapidly and tirelessly. Every book that wasn't available in Braille had to be read aloud, letter by letter, for Helen to absorb through touch. Tests were written on special slates. Discussions with professors were often conducted through intermediaries. Helen worked harder than any of her peers, not only to master the material, but also to navigate a system not built for her at all. Still, she thrived. She studied Greek and Latin, German and French, philosophy, mathematics, and literature. She read the works of Homer, Goethe, Shakespeare, and Plato. Her mind was hungry, expansive, and endlessly curious. Helen didn't just memorize, she questioned. She challenged me. She formed opinions and shared them boldly in essays and discussions. Her professors were initially unsure of what to expect, but quickly realized they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Her education, however, came at a cost. Anne Sullivan was by her side every waking moment. The physical toll of constant interpreting and emotional support began to wear on Anne's health. Her eyesight, already weak, was deteriorating, and her nerves were frayed. But her devotion to Helen never wavered. The bond they had formed over the years had become unbreakable. In 1903, while still in college, Helen published her first major book, The Story of My Life. Written with the assistance of John Albert Macy, her tutor and later Anne Sullivan's husband, the book chronicled Helen's early years, her breakthrough at the water pump, and her educational journey. It was not just a memoir, it was a revelation. Readers around the world were captivated by her honesty, clarity, and poetic voice. The story of the girl who had once lived in total isolation and had now mastered language, literacy, and complex thought became an inspiration. Helen's writing was vivid and elegant. She described the sensations of nature, the feel of springtime, the texture of a book beneath her fingers, and the thrill of learning. In one passage she wrote, "Everything has its wonders, even darkness and silence, and I learn, whatever state I may be in, therein to be content." The book was a critical and commercial success. It was translated into multiple languages and placed Helen in the public spotlight like never before. For the first time, the world was hearing directly from her, not through journalists or second-hand accounts, but from her own pen. And they listened. In 1904, Helen Keller graduated cum laude from Radcliffe College. She was 24 years old. Her graduation marked a milestone, not only for her, but for the world. It proved that with the right tools and support, barriers of communication and disability could be overcome. It shattered the assumptions held by even the most well-meaning skeptics. Helen Keller had not only learned to read and write, she'd become a scholar, an author, and a symbol of possibility. But Helen was not content to stop there. Now equipped with an education and a public platform, she began to shift her focus beyond personal achievement. Her years at Radcliffe had exposed her to ideas, radical, political, and philosophical, that stirred something new in her. She had read Thomas Paine, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, and H.G. Wells. She studied history, economics, and politics, and she began to ask deeper questions about society. Why is poverty so widespread? Why do so many people suffer? What is the role of government, of industry, of justice? Her education had given her knowledge, but it also gave her purpose. In the years that followed, Helen Keller would evolve from a miracle student into something else entirely: an advocate, an activist, and a public intellectual. She had spent her early years learning how to communicate and how to interpret the world. Now, she would dedicate the rest of her life to changing it. After graduating from Radcliffe College in 1904, Helen Keller stood at a remarkable crossroads. She had defied nearly every expectation the world had placed on her. She had learned to read and write, earned a college degree, published her autobiography, and inspired millions. But Helen, now in her mid-20s, was not interested in simply being admired. She had no desire to be a symbol frozen in place. She wanted to live, to think, to speak for those who could not. With the foundation of education beneath her, Helen Keller began turning her attention outward. Her time at Radcliffe had exposed her to a vast world of ideas, and she had studied not just literature and philosophy, but also social and economic theory. The works of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Henry George made a deep impression on her. She read not with passive interest, but with the intensity of someone seeking answers. Why, she wondered, were so many people, especially those with disabilities, living in poverty, neglected by society, and dismissed as burdens or outcasts? Why were industrial workers toiling in dangerous conditions for meager pay? Why did women lack equal rights? Why did people of color suffer under segregation and oppression? Helen came to believe that the systems around her, not individual failings, were responsible for much of the suffering she saw. And as someone who had once lived in total silence and isolation, she knew what it meant to be forgotten. That empathy became her compass. By 1909, Helen Keller made a bold political move. She joined the Socialist Party of America. It was a stunning decision, especially for someone as publicly revered as she was. Many who had admired her achievements were now uncomfortable. Newspapers that once celebrated her brilliance began to question her judgment. Some claimed she was being manipulated. Others dismissed her opinions by pointing to her disability, suggesting she couldn't possibly understand politics. Helen did not flinch. She responded publicly to her critics, saying, "They took my strength and made it a hollow show. But now that I speak for the poor, the disabled, and the oppressed, they say my voice no longer matters." Her speeches and writings grew increasingly focused on labor rights, universal education, accessibility, and the dignity of every human life. She spoke passionately against war, imperialism, and economic exploitation. She criticized large corporations for hoarding wealth and ignoring the well-being of their workers. She supported women's suffrage and racial equality decades before such views were considered mainstream. Helen Keller became a public intellectual, writing essays, giving lectures through interpreters, and publishing articles in political journals. She corresponded with influential figures around the world: activists, writers, labor organizers, and politicians. Her circle of influence expanded well beyond educational reform into the very core of the social justice movement. At the same time, she continued working to improve the lives of people with disabilities. She helped raise money for schools for the blind and deaf, advocated for the widespread adoption of Braille in libraries and public institutions, and pushed for better training for teachers working with students with disabilities. She remained involved with Perkins, the American Foundation for the Blind, and later, international organizations focused on disability rights. Throughout this period, Anne Sullivan remained by Helen's side. Their bond had evolved from teacher and student to something more like sisters, or perhaps co-authors of a shared journey. Anne, who had once taught Helen how to spell water, now sat beside her as she debated economics with senators and journalists. But Anne's health continued to decline. Her eyesight had worsened, and the physical demands of traveling and interpreting were taking a heavy toll. In 1914, Anne married John Macy, the literary scholar who had helped edit The Story of My Life. For a time, the three lived and worked together, but the marriage grew strained and eventually faded into separation, though never officially ending. Helen remained deeply connected to Anne, emotionally and practically. When Anne could no longer manage all of Helen's interpreting needs, a new figure entered their circle. Polly Thompson, a Scottish woman who began working as a secretary, but quickly became Helen's second interpreter and companion. The three women, Helen, Anne, and Polly, formed a small, devoted household, often traveling together and working in tandem to keep Helen's writing, speaking, and activism alive. When Anne's health deteriorated further in the 1920s, Polly stepped more fully into the role of assistant. Despite personal loss and constant physical exhaustion, Helen Keller never slowed down. She wrote more books, including Out of the Dark, a collection of essays on socialism, and continued publishing editorials and speaking at events across the country. She even wrote a book on religion titled My Religion, later revised and published as Light in My Darkness, where she described her belief in Swedenborgian Christianity, a faith that emphasized the connection between spiritual understanding and moral purpose. By the 1920s and into the 1930s, Helen Keller had become more than a celebrated former student. She was a moral force, using her platform to challenge the powerful and uplift the marginalized. She raised awareness, but she also raised expectations, demanding that society do better and that disabled people not only be accommodated, but also included, respected, and empowered. As the world entered the turmoil of the Great Depression, Helen's message resonated with many. She had always believed that adversity could be overcome, but not alone. Her own life had proven the importance of connection, education, and opportunity. And now she was determined to see those principles applied on a global scale. But there were more challenges ahead, political ones, personal ones, and the onset of a world war that would test her convictions like never before. By the late 1930s, Helen Keller's voice resonated far beyond American shores. She had long transcended the image of the miracle child who had overcome impossible odds. Now, she was a respected international advocate, speaking out boldly against injustice, inequality, and ignorance, issues she understood personally and intellectually. As the world sank deeper into the Great Depression, Helen recognized clearly how economic hardship disproportionately affected vulnerable populations, including those with disabilities. She argued that social responsibility and collective action were essential, not only to recover from the crisis, but also to create lasting, meaningful change. Helen's public presence during this time was remarkable. With the steadfast support of Anne Sullivan Macy and Polly Thompson, she traveled extensively, speaking at events across the United States, Canada, and eventually around the globe. Wherever she went, Helen brought messages of empowerment, human rights, and social reform, connecting disability advocacy to broader humanitarian concerns. In 1936, Helen faced one of the greatest personal losses of her life. Anne Sullivan Macy, her beloved companion, mentor, and guide, passed away after years of declining health. Anne's death devastated Helen. For nearly half a century, Anne had been her interpreter, confidant, and closest friend. Helen's grief was profound, deeply personal, and felt as a shattering blow. In tribute to Anne, Helen wrote, "My teacher is so close to me that I scarcely think of myself apart from her. Her death brought darkness again, but she taught me that even darkness can contain light." Despite the pain, Helen refused to retreat into silence. Polly Thompson, who had already taken on a larger role due to Anne's illness, now stepped fully into the role of interpreter and primary companion. Polly's gentle manner and unwavering loyalty helped Helen through this period of mourning, allowing her to continue her work without interruption. In the years leading up to and throughout World War II, Helen's activism took on even greater urgency. She condemned fascism, militarism, and discrimination, calling them the enemies of humanity's progress. Her writings became more pointed, challenging those in power to act morally, not just politically. Her speeches emphasized unity, cooperation, and compassion, core principles she believed essential to both domestic and international relations. After the war, Helen Keller became an unofficial ambassador of goodwill. Her status as a globally recognized figure allowed her to cross political boundaries with remarkable ease. In 1946, she embarked on a groundbreaking international tour, visiting over 35 countries to raise awareness about the needs and rights of disabled individuals around the world. Her travels took her to Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. Everywhere she went, she advocated for improved education, healthcare, and equal rights. In Japan, she met with survivors of the atomic bombings, deeply moved by their suffering and resilience. In India, she was warmly welcomed by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and inspired many local leaders with her passionate speeches about education and accessibility. Helen also visited schools and institutions for the blind and deaf in each country, tirelessly campaigning for better conditions, expanded educational opportunities, and increased societal understanding. Though she travelled extensively, her presence was never merely symbolic. She made genuine connections wherever she went. Helen Keller was able to communicate intimately with the blind, deaf, and disabled around the world, transcending language and cultural barriers through shared experience and profound empathy. Her impact on international disability rights was transformative, laying the groundwork for later global initiatives and movements. In 1955, Helen's life again took a dramatic turn when she received an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature for a film about her life titled Helen Keller in Her Story. Directed by Nancy Hamilton, the documentary introduced a new generation to Helen's extraordinary journey. Accepting the award, Helen used the platform to highlight the continued struggle for disability rights, declaring that her story was not just her own, but the story of millions who wait for understanding, opportunity, and justice. Despite this recognition, her life was not without further heartbreak. Polly Thompson, who had become an indispensable part of Helen's daily existence, suffered a stroke in 1957. Helen again experienced the painful vulnerability of losing a close companion and interpreter. Polly passed away in 1960, marking yet another profound personal loss for Helen. But Helen had long since learned resilience. After Polly's passing, a new assistant, Winnie Corbally, stepped in to help. Though Winnie could never replace Anne or Polly emotionally, she provided the necessary support that allowed Helen, now elderly, to maintain her independence and continue her advocacy. During these later years, Helen's work increasingly focused on global poverty, international education, and expanding the public's understanding of disability. She became actively involved with the American Foundation for the Overseas Blind, now Helen Keller International, raising funds, awareness, and support for programs aimed at reducing preventable blindness and improving access to education in developing countries. Helen's lifelong mission had evolved from personal education to international human rights advocacy. She had become one of the most influential public figures of the 20th century, a relentless voice for those marginalized by disability, poverty, or prejudice. Her writings were widely published and translated, her speeches attended by thousands, and her presence deeply respected by world leaders, activists, and ordinary people alike. As she aged, Helen began to reflect more frequently on her life and legacy. While she recognized that significant progress had been made in the rights of disabled individuals, she also acknowledged there was much more to be done. She consistently emphasized the importance of education, accessibility, and inclusivity, arguing passionately that society's true measure of greatness was its ability to care for and empower those most vulnerable. In these reflections, Helen Keller's voice remained unwavering, her commitment to social justice undiminished. She had spent her life breaking barriers, shattering stereotypes, and redefining what was possible for people with disabilities. Now, in her twilight years, she urged future generations to continue this fight, to look beyond personal accomplishments and towards collective responsibility. Helen Keller, who once had been trapped in darkness and silence, had become a beacon of moral clarity and humanitarian wisdom. But even after decades of relentless activism, she knew her work wasn't finished yet. New challenges and opportunities awaited, and the legacy she had built would inspire generations to come. As the 1960s unfolded, Helen Keller had become a revered elder stateswoman in the global movement for disability rights and humanitarian advocacy. She had spent decades tirelessly traveling, speaking, and writing, urging societies to recognize and respect the dignity and potential of every individual, especially those living with disabilities. Now in her 80s, Helen gradually reduced her travel, focusing instead on writing and reflecting. She continued to dictate letters and essays, passionately expressing her lifelong beliefs in social justice, equal rights, and education. Her days, though quieter now, were filled with deep thought, lively discussions, and continuous correspondence with friends and fellow activists worldwide. Despite declining physical health, Helen's intellectual vitality remained strong. She maintained an active role in the American Foundation for the Blind, regularly meeting with new generations of advocates and educators who looked to her for guidance. Her home became a pilgrimage site for those inspired by her life and work, visited by students, educators, disability rights activists, and admirers from all walks of life. During this period, Helen Keller received numerous awards and honors recognizing her lifelong achievements. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor. The medal recognized her extraordinary contributions to disability advocacy, civil rights, and international humanitarianism. At the ceremony, President Johnson remarked, "Helen Keller embodies the dignity of the human spirit. Her story reminds us that no physical barrier can stand against courage, intelligence, and determination." Though honored by such accolades, Helen remained humble, often redirecting praise to those who had supported her, particularly Anne Sullivan and Polly Thompson, without whom her achievements might never have been possible. She continually emphasized the collective effort required to create real, lasting change, always advocating for teamwork, empathy, and collaboration. Even into her later years, Helen never stopped pushing boundaries. Her progressive views on disability, politics, and equality continue to challenge societal norms. She openly supported civil rights, applauded the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and spoke out against racial segregation and injustice. Her writings from this period consistently linked disability rights with broader civil rights struggles, recognizing that freedom and equality were inseparable from one another. Helen's legacy was not limited to disability advocacy. She was a staunch peace activist, vocally opposing the nuclear arms race and US military interventions. In speeches and essays, she argued passionately against war, emphasizing that resources spent on military might would be better used combating poverty, disease, and ignorance worldwide. Her voice resonated with the younger generations, particularly those coming of age during the Vietnam War era. As she approached the end of her life, Helen Keller grew increasingly reflective. She considered the enormous progress made during her lifetime, acknowledging that the world she inhabited as an elderly woman was vastly different from the silent darkness of her early years. Yet she remained acutely aware that much work still needed to be done. She repeatedly stressed that true progress required continuous vigilance, relentless advocacy, and an enduring commitment to justice and equality. In one of her final public messages, Helen wrote, "Life is either a daring adventure or nothing at all. Security does not exist in nature, nor do the children of humanity as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. The fearful are caught as often as the bold. We must dare to be bold in the face of challenges." Helen Keller passed away peacefully on June 1st, 1968, at her home in Eastern Connecticut, just weeks before her 88th birthday. Her death marked the passing of one of the 20th century's most extraordinary figures, a woman whose life had been defined by immense struggle, unwavering determination, and transformative compassion. The news of Helen's death traveled swiftly around the world, prompting tributes and reflections from people of all backgrounds. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television programs paused to remember her remarkable journey, from an isolated childhood to global renown as an advocate for humanity's most vulnerable. At her funeral, she was remembered not just as a symbol of disability triumphing over adversity, but as a powerful force for social change. Her contributions extended far beyond personal achievement. She had transformed societal perceptions of disability, raised global awareness of accessibility and equality, and forever altered the narrative surrounding the potential of people with disabilities. Helen's ashes were placed alongside those of Anne Sullivan and Polly Thompson at the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., a fitting final resting place alongside the two women who had profoundly shaped her life and work. The site became a place of pilgrimage for those inspired by her example, a testament to the power of perseverance, education, and compassion. Yet, even in death, Helen Keller's influence did not diminish. The organizations she helped shape, such as Helen Keller International and the American Foundation for the Blind, continue to expand their missions, carrying on her legacy. Programs dedicated to education, healthcare, blindness prevention, disability rights advocacy, and social justice flourished, serving millions worldwide. In classrooms around the globe, her story became a fundamental part of curricula, inspiring generations of children to believe in their own potential and to recognize the dignity of all people. The United Nations honored Helen Keller by naming its international disability advocacy programs after her, highlighting her contributions to global disability rights. Her writings continue to be translated, studied, and cherished, influencing countless activists, educators, writers, and students. Perhaps her most enduring legacy was the profound shift in how society viewed disability itself. Helen Keller demonstrated conclusively that disabilities were not limitations to personal achievement or meaningful contributions to society. She proved that with adequate resources, education, and support, people with disabilities could achieve anything: academic excellence, creative expression, political influence, and profound societal impact. Decades after her passing, Helen Keller's life remains a beacon, challenging us to reject assumptions, break down barriers, and strive continually for a more inclusive and compassionate world. Her story serves as a vivid reminder of human resilience and the boundless potential within every individual, regardless of the challenges they face. Helen once famously said, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much."